I'm a fan of the five. I learned so much from the Chinese in this life of mine now. The amazing revelation and insight of the I Ching. The brilliance of its mathematics, the perfection of its mathematics. But also the understanding of the five elements. The recognition that our DNA, RNA is five. That the fives are all over the place. And it's one of the things to understand the way in which we're organized. We're organized in fives. One, you're alone. With two people, you can form a partnership. And again, I'm talking about the outside. When you get to three, the matrix changes. And three is tension. And it's tension because of the way the genes operate. The genes want you to make more in order to replenish the species. So if you're a couple and you have one child, you're in trouble with your genes. They want you to have another one. And so they're going to leave you with nothing but tension until you produce the fourth one, the fourth number. 4 is stable. That is, if you're two people and you have two children, what you've done is your duty genetically. In other words, you've provided a replacement. But replacement isn't enough. The genes get nervous. What if they die? What if they're gay? What if they're priests? What are you going to do? So you might as well have another one and make it all work. That's the 5. And 5 brings hierarchy. So 3 is tension, 4 is stability, 5 is hierarchy. We all come together in 5s. If you could really see the way things worked, you'd be astonished. I have all these people in my life who are always looking for aliens and don't recognize that we're one of them. I mean, if you could really see pentas at work, if you could really understand, visually, conceptually what that meant, because basically what happens is that every time you bring more than 2 auras together, a creature emerges. A creature emerges that is none of those 3 people. Isn't even the whole that's greater than the sum of the parts, because it isn't. And the first thing that happens is all kinds of things get cut away, and only certain things remain the moment you become that 3. And that if you're just the 3, there's going to be tension there. 3 people at a table. You can only look at one person at a time. You automatically got a problem when you're dealing on the outside. Put 4 people at a table, everything's stable. Put 5 people at a table and you'll notice that there is a hierarchy immediately established. Who will speak first, who will do what. There's a rule that's set up. Pentas are at work. At every level of life. And if you go down into what we are and into our purest nature, there's only one thing that every one of you have always been from the beginning, and I mean the beginning, way back to the Big Bang. From the moment those crystals shattered billions upon billions of years ago, your crystal has always operated, your personality crystal has always operated through the same base. There are 5 bases. The base that you have today is the base you had in your last life. And the life before that, 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 and the life before that. Which means that every human being comes into existence, all consciousness comes into existence fixed in 1/5 of the itness of everything. We're designed to fill in the gaps. We're designed to get the rest of that view, because basically what a base represents is a perspective. A fixed perspective that's lasted through eternity. It's the only thing that's fixed. And it's a 5, and it's one of a 5. Everything about the development of consciousness operates through 5s. We're not participating in that. Consciously. We're not. Over the last year and a half, as I've opened up this information, the results that I get in terms of what people have noticed and the things that they're working at, you begin finally to see, because it gives you access to begin to explore it, to begin to understand how powerful it is, how powerful the penta is. And it is always on display. Always. It's one of the things about pentas. This is how they affirm the culture. Now look. The great-grandmother of a rave? She was looking for her penta. This is what's going to make them so different. See, what's going to make them so different is that it's going to be very natural for them to share awareness, not to communicate intelligence. That's what we do. We communicate our intelligence to each other. They're going to share awareness. And they're going to share awareness not from the sense of, here's my little piece of awareness in the mix, and I'm sharing this little piece of awareness with you. No. They're going to share the awareness that emerges. That's quite different. Because again, the awareness that emerges is going to be limited by the matrix. In other words, the rave penta is going to operate here. This is going to be its matrix. It's not the same matrix, not at all the same matrix as how the human penta operates, in which we do not have access, other than the fact that I've described or revealed the mechanics of how that operates. But the fact is that we don't consciously connect to it. So these beings, that's something that's really different. You see, they're going to share an awareness. Now, everything about the nature of the penta is that the nature of the penta is that it determines our vision and direction in this life. And being able to share that awareness is waking up in the dream. Because they will finally start the long road that we're going to take of coming together and bonding together as one consciousness. I go back to the basic mysticism of human design, that the totality as we know it is an unborn child. Great discovery. I just wrote about it in my online magazine, Jovian Archive Report. They discovered 2 black holes in space. And these 2 black holes are so slowly circling each other in a dance. And eventually they're going to meet. And we don't know of any such event. It's almost like a mini Big Bang in that sense. And the byproduct of those 2 black holes ultimately bumping into each other is that, of course, there's going to be an enormous release of energy, and the very, very fabric of the universe is going to be, shall we say, altered in that event. The personality crystal hasn't come yet. Tomorrow I'm going to talk about what happens when the child gets its personality. There's no personality, no cosmic personality. It doesn't exist yet. It's why we don't have any true sense of oneness. We don't. Because there's nothing to unify us. After all, you've seen that everything about us is about mastering differentiation, not mastering oneness. It's been all about mastering differentiation. We've got to go to the differentiation before we can get back to the oneness. And that you don't get to oneness by all of a sudden everybody coming together in a big puddle. Because it doesn't work that way. The way we're going to get to oneness is a slow process built on the coming together of pentas, 5 at a time, slowly but surely. And eventually pentas meeting pentas, and so forth and so on. In other words, it's going to be a very different kind of process in which slowly out of the aloneness emerges the capacity to share awareness. Look, at the mystical level, what we represent is the developing design crystal of the whole. That's us. Any of you who have taken earlier grade courses of mine, particularly the Band 2 course, know that it's a joke that we call our personality crystal personality. They're all design. They're all design. The personality crystals we have masquerade as personality crystals. They have a special design function. They're helping us sort of to come to grips with the future. But there is no personality crystal yet. It's all a joke. Sort of. We have our little process that we're working out. But you see, this is our body. It's our body. When you see those incredible pictures of fetuses in the womb, and you see them moving their fingers, it's our body. This whole thing. And what runs this body? My design crystal. My design crystal runs my life. It runs my body. Out of that manifests my biochemical vehicle. You see, we're manifesting the biochemical vehicle of the totality. Yesterday, when I described the neutrinos streaming through and streaming out and doing so for billions of years, we're a programming agent. I was reading this incredible series of articles on neutrinos. By the way, thank you, that was wonderful. Some fascinating things in there. They're going to build neutrino factories now to stream neutrinos so they can measure this and that and whatever. And they're going to build neutrino telescopes to be able to look at things they've never, ever, ever been able to see before, because the magical thing about a neutrino is it can go through anything and isn't changed. We can send neutrinos through, debris clouds around black holes and all kinds of things, and we can find out all kinds of information. And they're beginning to see that the neutrino is something that is so spectacular. It's so spectacular. The best things, though, in that article was a little comment. And the little comment was that, unfortunately, the fact that neutrinos now have mass means that the basic principle of a unified way of looking at the universe, the basic model, no longer works. It no longer works. And their biggest problem is that neutrinos, I love this, neutrinos are only left-handed. Isn't that wonderful? Most things are left-handed and right-handed. That is, when you're dealing with subatomic particles. Neutrinos are only left-handed. I thought that was wonderful. Left-handed neutrinos. And the problem is that if you don't have a right hand, then how is the mass established? And they've got this thing, it's a theoretical thing, they call it a Bose-Higgs, which is basically something that's supposed to give gravitational mass to the way in which the standard model works. But now the standard model doesn't work anymore, and that's something they have to throw out the window, and they're back to square one with, how the hell does gravity work? How does it work? Now these people really have to start looking for magnetic monopoles to begin to understand literally that whole process. But the whole standard model is breaking down because of this whole advent of the neutrino field, the neutrino ocean, and what that really means. What it means to have so much matter. So much matter penetrating everything, everywhere, all the time. It's one of my favorite images is to see how things click together. And this is the whole thing about pentas. Pentas are meant to come together in order to come together with other pentas, and eventually you build up a network that becomes an enclosed sheath that literally becomes the consciousness field. And not a consciousness field the way we understand it, I can say very glibly, because it's simply a mathematical truth, I can say that the whole is always greater than the sum of the parts, and basically everybody goes ho-hum. Because you have no access to that whole, do you? Don't. So it's like, yeah, okay, another interesting concept. Not something that's really alive. See, they're going to know something. See, they're going to be the first step towards the merging of consciousness. Doesn't matter how long they live. It doesn't matter that they're only going to have 1,000 years or so. It doesn't make any difference. As you will see tomorrow, this is a dress rehearsal. It's just a dress rehearsal. It's setting the stage for the development of a singular consciousness in which all the aspects function together. And all the aspects function together not as separate entities, but they function together as the whole, despite their separateness. Because they have a shared common awareness, a shared common awareness. These children, they will not be able to make decisions alone. They won't. And it's not like they're going to need some human to help them. They're incomplete without the rest of the penta. It's clear to me that when the first birthing comes, that within hours, you're going to have 5 emerge at once. It's not going to come like, there will be a first one. There's always a first something. But the basic movement is that you're going to see that they're going to come in, and they're going to come in multiples of 5. I love the serendipity of media. I was tuned in, I think it was in the morning break. I turned on the news for a moment, and there's an Alfa Romeo car commercial. And the car commercial starts with a picture of 4 babies, obviously quadruplets. And the next scene you see is 4 adult women. One of them's in a business meeting, one of them's in a shop, one of them is sitting in a restaurant or something, and the other one is driving a new Alfa Romeo. And as she's driving along, she's getting more and more and more excited. And her siblings, okay, in this mythology of how twins feel, what others are feeling, and so forth and so on. In this commercial, the other women are all getting excited. So here's this woman sitting in a business meeting, and all of a sudden she's, and there's all this going on, and everybody's looking at them. And the closing line of this is, emotions are here to be shared. Magical. Just magical. But that's the movement. That's the movement. That shared awareness, which means that they're going to be the fact that 5 might come in at the same time in the beginning, one may be in Bhutan and one may be in Colombia. Who knows where they're going to be? It's also one of those things to consider. I don't even know if those first 5 will survive because of that. Unless there's an enormous amount of awareness on the part of humans, particularly humans who know this stuff, it's going to be very, very difficult for this mutation to take hold in the beginning. It's not going to be an obvious thing. And the other thing is, to an ignorant parent, that rave coming into their life is going to be sort of like an autistic child to them. It's not like the autism is, as we understand it, the communication difficulties. The natural tendency of the raved child is to try to meet at the emotional awareness level. They're not going to be dominated by the mental plane. We are. They're not going to be dominated by the splenic plane. The mammalian plant life is. Animal life, insect life, dominated by the splenic plane. They're going to be in a different plane, which means that it's going to be very difficult for them to respond to their human progenitor, their human parent, in a way in which the human parent recognizes something familiar. There's going to be this sense of, oh, there's something wrong with this child. That's why, the next 25 years, the work that has to be done in making sure the foundation is solid is also about making sure that people know that these children are coming. It's not just design. As I said, there's so many different traditions out here that are predicting some kind of change soon. So there is a growing level of awareness that something might, quote unquote, happen. But so important that we understand what to look for. These children are not going to have communicative skills in the way in which we understand them. And they're going to feel flat. Flat. Look, if you live in an emotional world, and you live in a world of the emotional motor, whether you're defined and you have your consistent motor, or you're undefined and you're always amplifying the motor, there is no flatness. It doesn't exist. Everything is up and down. Everything. And the emotional world is the only one we know. And the emotional motor is the only thing we know. As a matter of fact, if we give somebody a high dosage of Librium and we meet them, we're very uncomfortable with them. Because Librium is something that will flatten you out. It'll flatten away the emotional wave. These people often seem like they're empty, that they're not there, that somehow there's something missing in them. They don't even seem to be alive, in a sense. I don't know how many of you have had that experience, but when you're dealing with somebody that's had drugs that have been designed, particularly in cases of schizophrenia or these kinds of things, or hyperactivity or all this stuff where they give, Prozac, Librium, all these kinds of things to flatten people out. Now think about these children. These children are going to be born flat. They're not going to amplify the emotional wave, and they're not going to give off an emotional wave. And they're going to feel very funny to us. Oh, they're not going to be like us at all. It's one of the jokes about autistic children, how well they get along with animals. Animals don't have an emotional system. So for them, that's something that they can relate to. So you can imagine that these children are going to have a great deal of difficulty relating to human beings and their emotional motors. And that the human beings with the emotional motors are going to look at these children and the flatness of them and get frightened. What's wrong with my baby? What's wrong with my baby? My baby doesn't make any sounds. You're going to have babies that are silent for a long time. No longer the pressure on the 12th gate. It's there in the 55. Basically their antenna is up, waiting to find their consciousness field. Remember, they're born incomplete. See, we're born whole. It's the advantage of our aloneness. We're born whole. They're going to be born incomplete. And they're not going to be complete until they make up a viable penta. And only then is their consciousness going to operate correctly. My real concern is that we're going to need a very powerful generation of knowledgeable people who are going to be able to catch the signs of these children emerging. That we can put out enough information so that parents, given the technologies we have, the access we have, that enough parents in enough places at least, have a suggestion of, you may have one of these kids. Here they are. And after all, the people that we're going to influence over the next 25 years, they're the ones who are going to give birth to these children. They're the ones that are going to be part of that process. They need to know, because these children need to be protected, because they're going to feel very odd. They're going to be flat. And this is immediately, imagine what that's like for a mother. You have your baby, and your baby has no emotional system. Nothing but fear in a human mother will emerge from such an event. Nothing but fear. What's wrong with my child? And we have to make sure that there aren't all kinds of these children that end up being institutionalized because they get diagnosed as being this or that or the other thing that has nothing to do with what they are. And one of the things that will hopefully be possible is that some kind of organization or institution can come into existence that will simply gather these children up. You're going to have human parents that will not be able to raise these children at all, any more than human parents are successful at raising autistic children. They're not. It's a disaster. And the vast majority of autistic children have to be institutionalized because they simply don't have those that can cope with them. And to be able to recognize that even though these children are not going to be autistic, the fact is that the way in which they will relate to their human parent is going to be so difficult that in most cases those human parents are going to want to do something about it. The whole thing is to make sure that there's going to be, venues available, possibilities available for these children that they can be gathered together, because only when they're gathered together, are they finally going to function correctly. And by the way, it's not so much that we on the outside will understand how that functioning is working. I don't know how much they'll ever tell us. I don't know how much language they'll ever develop, because quite frankly, as long as they find each other, they don't need it. Language is really trip. We've got all these different languages, and we've got all these different vocabularies, and we've got all this stuff, and how much energy it takes to articulate these things. That they have to go from the deep gray areas and finally get to the throat and be articulated and blah, 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 and on and on. If you're part of a penta and you're a rave, and you're living a single consciousness shared, there is no need to communicate. There's nothing to communicate. There's nobody to talk to. You are something together. It's a totally different process. So I don't even know if these children are going to have much interest, in any developmental sense, to have any focus whatsoever on developing linguistic or language skills. It's so interesting that individuality, which is the dynamic theme of this opening of a new era, that individuality is fundamentally acoustic. And if you touch the soul of an individual and you ask them, what is the most beautiful thing that you know in life? They will tell you silence. Nothing more magical than silence. Silence on the outside, silence on the inside, quiet, perfect, peaceful. So, one of the jokes of the rave is how quiet they will be, how silent they will be. No need to make any noise. Totally different. Totally different.